The winter of 1887 brought something the old-timers in Arizona Territory had never seen before. Snow fell thick and heavy across the desert landscape, turning the familiar red rocks white and sending temperatures plummeting to 40 degrees below zero. Even the Apache, who had survived in this harsh land for countless generations, found themselves struggling against nature's unexpected fury. Running Bear crouched beside the dying embers of what had once been a warming fire outside his family's wickiup. The wind howled through the canyon walls like angry spirits, carrying with it the promise of more snow. His wife, Morningstar, held their youngest child close to her chest, trying to share what little warmth remained in her body. Their other two children huddled together under a thin blanket, their lips already turning blue from the bitter cold. The Apache band had been moving through the mountains when the storm struck 3 days ago. What should have been a simple journey to their winter camp had turned into a fight for survival. The sudden blizzard had scattered their horses and buried most of their supplies under feet of snow. Now, 23 members of the band found themselves trapped in a small canyon with little food, no adequate shelter, and temperatures that seemed to drop lower with each passing hour. Running Bear looked around at his people and felt his heart grow heavy. Old Grandfather Crow Feather sat motionless against a rock wall, his breathing shallow and labored. Little Fox, barely 8 winters old, had stopped shivering altogether, which Running Bear knew was a dangerous sign. The medicine man, Singing Wolf, had used the last of his healing herbs 2 days ago, and now he could only offer prayers to the spirits. As the leader of this small band, Running Bear felt the weight of every life on his shoulders. These were not warriors preparing for battle, but families trying to survive. There were children who had never known such cold, women heavy with unborn babies, and elders whose old bones ached with each gust of frigid wind. The Apache had always been proud people, masters of survival in the desert, but this storm was unlike anything in their collective memory. The sound of horses struggling through deep snow echoed off the canyon walls. Running Bear grabbed his rifle and motioned for the other men to take defensive positions. In these desperate times, any stranger could be a threat to their dwindling resources. But as the figures emerged from the swirling snow, Running Bear saw something that made him lower his weapon slightly. A lone man on horseback approached slowly, leading a pack mule behind him. Even from a distance, Running Bear could see this was not an Apache. The stranger wore the thick coat and hat of a white settler, and his horse bore the kind of supplies that Running Bear's people desperately needed. Steam rose from both man and beast in the frigid air, and icicles hung from the horse's mane like crystal ornaments. The stranger stopped about 50 yards away and raised one hand in a gesture of peace. His voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air as he called out, asking if anyone spoke English. Running Bear understood the white man's language, though he rarely chose to use it. He had learned it during his brief time at the government school, before he escaped back to his people and their traditional ways. For a moment, time seemed frozen like the landscape around them. Here was everything Running Bear's band needed to survive, carried by a man who represented the people who had driven them from their ancestral lands, the same people who had killed Apache warriors, taken Apache children, and forced the survivors onto reservations where many had died of disease and despair. Running Bear felt the eyes of his people upon him, waiting to see what their leader would decide. Some of the younger warriors had their hands on their weapons, ready to take what they needed by force if necessary. The stranger sat perfectly still on his horse, either unaware of the danger he faced or choosing to trust in the mercy of people who had little reason to show him any. The wind picked up again, sending snow devils dancing across the canyon floor. In that moment, Running Bear realized that this encounter would test everything he believed about honor, survival, and what it truly meant to be Apache. The storm had brought them to the edge of death, but it had also brought them a choice that would define who they really were when stripped of everything except their humanity. Thomas McKenna had been traveling for 6 days through country that no sensible man would attempt in such weather. The former cavalry scout turned traitor had been caught by the same storm that trapped the Apache, but his years of experience in these mountains had taught him to read the signs. When the snow began falling harder than usual, he had loaded his pack mule with extra supplies and headed for higher ground, knowing that storms in this region could last for weeks. What he had not expected was to find himself face to face with a band of Apache who looked like they were barely clinging to life. McKenna had encountered Apache before during his military service, usually at the wrong end of a rifle. He had seen their skill as warriors, their pride as a people, and their fierce determination to protect their way of life. But the group before him now looked nothing like the formidable fighters he remembered. McKenna could see children huddled together for warmth, women trying to shelter babies from the wind, and men whose usual proud bearing had been bent by hunger and cold. The sight stirred something in him that had nothing to do with old conflicts or racial differences. These were human beings facing death, and he carried on his pack mule the very things that could save them. The Apache leader stepped forward, his rifle held ready but not directly aimed. McKenna recognized the bearing of authority even in these desperate circumstances. The man was tall and lean, with intelligent eyes that seemed to measure everything about the stranger before him. When he spoke, his English was clear but careful, each word chosen with precision. Running Bear asked McKenna who he was and what brought him to this place. There was no hostility in his voice, but there was wariness, the caution of a man responsible for protecting people who could not protect themselves. McKenna answered honestly, explaining that he was a trader traveling to Fort Verde when the storm caught him. He had been following old hunting trails, trying to find shelter, when he heard voices echoing off the canyon walls. As they spoke, McKenna noticed details that told him just how desperate the situation had become. The Apache had no visible food supplies, their fire was nearly dead, and several people appeared to be showing signs of severe cold exposure. The children were too quiet, which any experienced frontiersman knew was a bad sign. These people needed help immediately, or some of them would not see another sunrise. Running Bear studied the white man carefully, trying to read his intentions. In his experience, white settlers who encountered Apache in vulnerable situations usually responded with either fear or aggression. They might ride away quickly to report the Apache location to the cavalry, or they might try to take advantage of the situation somehow. But this man seemed different. There was no fear in his eyes and no calculation, just a kind of steady evaluation that Running Bear recognized as the mark of an experienced survivor. The pack mule behind McKenna carried supplies that Running Bear could identify even at a distance. Blankets were rolled and tied to the animal's sides, along with what appeared to be food supplies and other necessities for surviving in winter conditions. The mule itself looked well fed and strong, unlike the Apache horses that had either scattered in the storm or were too weak from lack of forage to be of much use. McKenna made a decision that surprised even himself. He dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening, and began untying some of the supplies from his pack mule. Running Bear tensed, unsure what the stranger intended, but McKenna's actions soon became clear. He was preparing to share his supplies with people who had every reason to distrust him. The white man pulled down several heavy blankets and a bag that clearly contained food. He looked directly at Running Bear and spoke words that would echo in Apache oral tradition for generations to come. McKenna said that no one, regardless of their differences, should have to watch their children freeze to death when help was available. He offered to share what he had, asking for nothing in return except the chance to weather the storm together. Running Bear felt something shift inside him, a recognition that transcended the bitter history between their peoples. Here was a man who understood that survival sometimes required setting aside old grievances and choosing compassion over conflict. The Apache leader found himself faced with a choice that would test not only his own character, but the very values his people held sacred. The wind continued to howl around them, but somehow the silence between the two men seemed louder than the storm. Behind Running Bear, his people waited to see how their leader would respond to this unexpected offer of mercy from a stranger who had every reason to be their enemy. Running Bear stood in the swirling snow, feeling the weight of history and the immediate needs of his people pulling him in different directions. Every instinct developed through years of conflict with white settlers told him to be suspicious. Too many times Apache bands had trusted white men only to find themselves betrayed, attacked, or led into traps that cost lives and freedom. But his eyes could not lie about what he saw before him. Little Fox was no longer moving at all, her small body still impale against her mother's chest. Grandfather Crow Feather's breathing had become so shallow that Running Bear wondered if the old man was already walking the spirit trail. His own wife, Morning Star, looked at him with eyes that held both trust and desperate hope, trusting that he would make the right choice for their family and their people. The young warriors in his band watched him carefully, ready to follow whatever decision he made. Whitehawk, barely 20 winters old and eager to prove his courage, had his hand resting on his knife handle. He represented the voice of traditional Apache pride that said they should take what they needed by force, rather than accept charity from an enemy. But Running Bear also saw Silent Eagle, an older warrior whose own children had died in a cavalry attack years before. Nodding slightly toward the stranger's supplies with understanding in his eyes, McKenna remained perfectly still, allowing the Apache leader time to make his decision without pressure. The former scout had seen enough death in his years on the frontier to recognize when people were truly desperate. He had also seen enough of Apache culture to understand that accepting help from an outsider would be difficult for a proud people, but he had made his offer sincerely, and now he waited with the patience of a man who understood that some decisions could not be rushed. Running Bear thought of his grandfather's teachings about what it meant to be truly strong. The old stories spoke of warriors who showed their greatest courage not in battle, but in moments when they chose wisdom over pride. His grandfather had told him that sometimes the hardest fight was against the anger and suspicion in one's own heart, especially when survival depended on trusting those who had once been enemies. The Apache leader made his choice with the quiet dignity that had always marked his decisions. He stepped forward and spoke to McKenna in careful English, thanking him for his offer and accepting it on behalf of his people. But Running Bear also made something clear in his response that reflected the code by which he lived. He told McKenna that the Apache would remember this kindness and that a debt had been created that would someday be repaid. McKenna nodded his understanding and immediately began distributing supplies. He gave the heaviest blankets to the families with the smallest children, understanding without being told who needed warmth most desperately. From his food supplies, he pulled out jerked meat, hardtack, and even some precious coffee that he had been saving for the coldest nights. But most importantly, he had materials for building a proper fire that could sustain them through the continuing storm. The transformation that followed was swift but profound. Within an hour, a real fire was burning in the center of the canyon, its warmth beginning to reach even the most vulnerable members of the Apache band. Children who had been silent and still began to stir and speak in quiet voices. Grandfather Crow Feather opened his eyes and asked for water, the first words he had spoken in 2 days. Morning Star approached McKenna with her youngest child, a baby who had been growing weaker by the hour. The white man looked at the infant with the practiced eye of someone who had seen frontier medicine work its miracles and failures. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small flask of whiskey, explaining to Morning Star through gestures and simple words that a few drops mixed with warm water might help the baby maintain body heat. As the evening progressed, something remarkable began to happen. The invisible barriers that had stood between the Apache and their unexpected benefactor started to lower. McKenna found himself sharing coffee with Running Bear, and the two men began to talk about the storm, the terrain, and the challenges of surviving in such conditions. They discovered that they both understood the mountains, respected the power of winter weather, and had learned hard lessons about the importance of preparation and quick thinking. Whitehawk, the young warrior who had been most suspicious of the stranger, found himself helping McKenna tend to his horse and mule. The animals needed care in the severe weather, and Whitehawk's skill with horses was evident. As they worked together, McKenna shared stories of other storms he had weathered, and Whitehawk began to see that this white man understood and respected the challenges of life in Apache country. The storm continued to rage outside their shelter, but inside the circle of firelight, two very different peoples had found common ground in their shared humanity and their common struggle against the unforgiving forces of nature. By the second day of their unlikely partnership, the canyon had become a place where old enemies learned to see each other as simply people fighting the same battle against nature's fury. The storm showed no signs of letting up, but with McKenna's supplies and the Apache's knowledge of winter survival, the small band had transformed their desperate situation into something manageable. McKenna discovered that his assumptions about Apache life had been shaped more by frontier legends than reality. He watched Silent Eagle craft tools from seemingly nothing, turning broken branches and stone chips into useful implements with a skill that impressed the former scout. Morning Star showed him how to prepare pine needle tea that could prevent the sickness that killed many people during long winters. And Singing Wolf shared knowledge about reading weather signs that McKenna had never learned in all his years on the frontier. The children, who had been too cold and weak to play, began to show the resilience that had always marked Apache youth. Little Fox, who had nearly died from the cold, now helped her mother prepare food and listened wide-eyed as McKenna told stories of his travels through the territories. The baby that Morning Star had feared losing was now strong enough to cry lustily when hungry, a sound that brought smiles to faces that had been grim with worry. Running Bear found himself respecting the white man's practical knowledge and straightforward manner. McKenna asked questions about Apache customs not out of idle curiosity, but because he wanted to avoid accidentally giving offense to people who had shown him trust. When he learned that pointing directly at someone was considered rude, he adjusted his behavior immediately. When Singing Wolf explained that certain foods should not be prepared by men during specific ceremonies, McKenna accepted the instruction without argument or mockery. On the third morning, the wind finally began to calm, though snow continued to fall steadily. McKenna and Running Bear ventured to the canyon entrance to assess conditions for travel, and what they found was both encouraging and sobering. The storm was clearly weakening, but the snow was now deeper than either man had ever seen in this region. Any attempt to leave the canyon would require careful planning and shared effort. As they stood looking out at the white wilderness, Running Bear made a decision that reflected how much his thinking had changed over the past few days. He told McKenna that when they left the canyon, the Apache band would escort him safely to Fort Verde. The gesture was more than simple courtesy. It was a formal acknowledgement that McKenna had become someone worthy of Apache protection. McKenna was moved by the offer, understanding its significance in Apache culture. But he also made an offer of his own that surprised Running Bear. The trader suggested that instead of simply escorting him to the fort, they should travel together toward the Apache winter camp that Running Bear's band had been trying to reach when the storm struck. McKenna knew the country well and could guide them along routes that would be easier to navigate in deep snow. The proposal created intense discussion among the Apache. Some worried about bringing an outsider to their winter camp, a place where other bands would gather, and where the presence of a white man might create complications. Others argued that McKenna had proven himself trustworthy, and that his knowledge of the terrain could save lives during the difficult journey ahead. Grandfather Crow Feather, whose recovery had been remarkable once he was properly warmed and fed, provided the wisdom that settled the debate. The old man reminded his people that the spirits worked in mysterious ways, and that perhaps McKenna had been sent to them for a purpose larger than any of them could understand. He suggested that their experience with this white man might be preparation for a future when Apache and white people would need to find ways to live in peace. That evening, as they prepared for what they hoped would be their last night in the canyon, McKenna made an observation that would stay with Running Bear for the rest of his life. The trader pointed out that the terrible storm had stripped away everything that usually stood between people, leaving only their essential humanity visible. Without the distractions of possessions, status, or tribal identity, they had discovered that survival required the same virtues regardless of skin color or cultural background: courage, generosity, wisdom, and the willingness to put the welfare of others before personal pride. Running Bear nodded thoughtfully, understanding that McKenna had put into words something he had been feeling, but could not express. The storm had been a teacher, forcing them to learn lessons that might have taken years to discover under normal circumstances. It had shown them that their people's conflicts, while real and painful, did not have to define every interaction between individuals who chose to act with honor and compassion. As they banked the fire for the night and prepared to rest before attempting their journey, both men knew that they would leave the canyon forever changed by what they had experienced together. The storm was ending, but the bonds forged in its fury would endure long after the snow had melted and the immediate danger had passed. The journey from the canyon began at dawn on the fourth day, with McKenna leading the way on routes he had learned during his cavalry years and Running Bear providing guidance about reading the land in ways that ensured the safety of the women, children, and elders. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold remained bitter, and every step had to be carefully planned to avoid exhausting the weakest members of the group. McKenna shared his horse with Grandfather Crow Feather, understanding that the old man's survival depended on staying warm and conserving his strength. The pack mule carried Little Fox and two other small children, along with the remaining supplies that would sustain them during the 3-day journey to the Apache winter camp. The sight of Apache children riding safely on a white man's animals would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew the history of conflict between their peoples. As they traveled, McKenna began to understand the complexity of Apache society in ways that challenged everything he thought he knew. He observed how decisions were made through careful consultation rather than rigid hierarchy, how the needs of children and elders always came first, and how each person contributed according to their abilities without shame or competition. When Silent Eagle's wife went into early labor on the 2nd day of travel, the entire group stopped without question while Morning Star and the other women provided care and support. The birth of Silent Eagle's son during their journey became a moment of profound significance for everyone present. McKenna found himself helping to gather firewood and create windbreaks, while Apache women brought new life into the world in conditions that would have defeated less resilient people. When the healthy baby boy took his first breath in the freezing mountain air, even the hardened trader felt tears freeze on his cheeks. Running Bear asked McKenna to be present for the informal naming ceremony that followed the birth. The baby was given the name Stormwalker, in honor of his arrival during their extraordinary journey. But in a gesture that moved McKenna deeply, Running Bear also announced that the child would carry a second name in English, McKenna's friend, acknowledging the role the white man had played in ensuring that both mother and baby survived their ordeal. As they approached the Apache winter camp on the 3rd day, McKenna began to feel nervous about how his presence would be received by Apache, who had not shared their experience in the canyon. Running Bear seemed to understand his concern and explained that he would personally vouch for McKenna's character and tell the story of how the trader had chosen mercy over profit when he could have simply ridden away from their desperate situation. The winter camp was larger than McKenna had expected, with several bands gathered together for mutual support during the harsh season. Smoke rose from numerous fires, and the sound of children playing suggested a community that had successfully weathered the worst of the winter storms. But as Running Bear's group approached, McKenna could see warriors emerging from shelters with weapons ready, clearly concerned about the presence of a white stranger. Running Bear rode ahead to speak with the camp leaders, and McKenna could hear intense discussion. Even though he could not understand all the words being spoken, he remained where he was, understanding that his fate now rested entirely on the trust he had built with people who had good reason to be suspicious of any outsider. The children who had traveled with him stayed close, as if their presence might somehow protect him from misunderstanding. After what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, Running Bear returned with 3 older Apache men, whom McKenna recognized as leaders by their bearing and the deference shown to them by others. One of them was Bear Claw, a war chief whose reputation for fierce fighting was known throughout the territory. Another was Wise Owl, a medicine man whose spiritual authority was respected by multiple bands. The third was an elderly man whose name McKenna did not know, but whose age and dignity marked him as someone of great importance. Bear Claw stepped forward and addressed McKenna directly in English, testing the white man's composure and intentions with blunt questions about why he had come to their camp and what he hoped to gain from his association with Apache people. McKenna answered honestly, explaining that he had simply chosen to help people in need and had been invited to travel with them to safety. He made no claims of special understanding or friendship beyond what had been earned through shared hardship. Wise Owl asked different questions, focusing on McKenna's understanding of Apache customs and his willingness to respect ways that might seem strange to white people. The medicine man seemed particularly interested in how McKenna had responded to the birth of Storm Walker and whether he understood the spiritual significance of a child being born during such a journey. The elderly leader, who McKenna learned was called Grandfather Stonebear, asked the most challenging question of all. He wanted to know what McKenna would do when he left the Apache camp and returned to the white world. Would he keep the location of their winter camp secret? Would he speak truthfully about what he had experienced with Apache people? Would he remember the lessons learned during the storm? Or would he return to old prejudices once the immediate crisis had passed? McKenna stood before the Apache leaders knowing that his answer would determine not only his immediate safety, but also whether the bridge built during the storm would survive contact with the wider world. He chose his words carefully, speaking from the heart about what the experience had taught. him about the difference between the stories people told about each other and the reality of who they actually were when tested by genuine hardship. He promised Grandfather Stone Bear that he would never reveal the location of Apache camps or movements to military authorities, understanding that such information could lead to attacks on innocent families. He pledged to speak truthfully about Apache people when he encountered the prejudice and fear that dominated most white settlements, even though he knew such honesty might cost him business and friendships in his own community. But most importantly, McKenna made a commitment that surprised even himself. He told the Apache leaders that he wanted to establish a trading relationship based on fairness and mutual respect, offering to serve as a bridge between their communities and the white settlements that were increasingly dominating the territory. He proposed bringing supplies that Apache families needed in exchange for goods and knowledge that could benefit both peoples. The three leaders withdrew to discuss McKenna's words while the trader waited nervously for their decision. Running Bear stood beside him, and McKenna realized that the Apache leader was prepared to defend him if necessary, putting his own standing in the community at risk for someone who had been a stranger just days before. The gesture reinforced McKenna's understanding of how profoundly their shared experience had changed both men. When the leaders returned, Bearclaw spoke for the group with words that would echo through Apache oral tradition for generations. He announced that McKenna would be welcomed as a friend of the Apache people, but that this friendship came with responsibilities as well as privileges. The trader would be expected to prove his sincerity through actions over time, not just words spoken in a moment of crisis. Wise Owl performed a brief ceremony that formally recognized McKenna as someone who had earned the right to travel safely in Apache territory. The medicine man explained that the trader now carried a spiritual obligation to use his position as a bridge between worlds wisely, always remembering that his actions could affect the safety and welfare of people who had chosen to trust him. McKenna spent 3 more days in the Apache camp, observing how the various bands lived together in harmony, despite coming from different regions and sometimes having different perspectives on how to deal with the encroaching white civilization. He learned about Apache governance, their methods of education, their sophisticated understanding of the natural world, and their complex spiritual beliefs that saw all life as interconnected. When the time came for McKenna to continue his journey to Fort Verde, the farewell was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Little Fox, now fully recovered from her brush with death, presented him with a small beaded ornament that her mother had made during their stay in the camp. Stormwalker's parents asked McKenna to carry messages to a trading post where they hoped to send word to relatives on a distant reservation. Running Bear and McKenna clasped hands in the Apache manner, and the leader spoke words that would stay with the trader for the rest of his life. He said that the storm had been a teacher for both of them, showing that courage sometimes meant setting aside pride and anger to choose a more difficult path of understanding and cooperation. He hoped that their example might inspire others to find ways to build peace instead of continuing the cycle of conflict and revenge. As McKenna rode away from the Apache camp, leading his pack mule through snow that was finally beginning to melt, he carried with him more than just the memory of an extraordinary experience. He had discovered that his assumptions about Apache people had been shaped by fear and ignorance rather than genuine knowledge. He had learned that survival often depended on the willingness to see beyond surface differences to the common humanity that connected all people. The story of what happened during those days when the temperature dropped to 40 below zero became legendary in both Apache and white communities, though each group sometimes told it differently depending on their audience and their purpose. But for those who had actually lived through the experience, the truth was simpler and more profound than any legend. They had discovered that mercy was not weakness but the highest form of strength, and that choosing compassion over conflict could transform enemies into allies when people had the courage to set aside old grievances and embrace their shared humanity. McKenna kept his promises to the Apache people, becoming a trader known for his fairness and a voice for understanding in white communities that preferred simple stories of good and evil. Running Bear's band prospered, and the leader became known for his wisdom in finding ways to protect his people while building bridges to a changing world. The storm had ended, but the bonds forged in its fury continued to influence how both men approached the challenges that lay ahead, in a territory where two very different peoples were learning to share the same land.